Okay, welcome back. 4th of July week. Hope you're making plans for the weekend, and even more than that, I hope they work out for you. You never know. Best laid plans of mice and those others sometimes don't work. Here with us is a man who always has a plan. He is Webster Tarpley, our greatest living historian, and I'm always honored to have Webster on the program as a friend, but more than that, as a great resource for all of you to help understand, even if you don't agree, to get a better slant on things. Remember, the game here is to think. Even if you disagree, the game is to engage in the process. Welcome back, Mr. T.
Thank you very much, Jeff. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. As all things considered can be distilled, I guess that's the best way I can phrase it.
Well, it is now the middle point of the year, and
God, is it ever? Would it last about 3 months, and it's here? Jeez.
Big events, and maybe we can treat some of them. However, before we continue, I would like to talk mainly about domestic U.S. tonight for a change. But Before we do, we have to mark this 100 years since the beginning of World War I, or in particular since the Sarajevo assassinations of the Archduke and his wife,
which happened 1 year after the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. Interestingly enough,
yes. I don't know what in particular to make of that, except the one thing you can make of it is that the events leading up to World War II bear the imprint of Freemasonic lodges, a tremendous campaign by British-centered Freemasonic lodges, and some French ones, but it's the so-called Grand Orient, or Grand Orient, which was the center of French, the sort of Anglophile French Freemasons, and then on the British side we had naturally the York Rite and the Scottish Rite, but we also had these special ones like the Quatuor Coronati Lodge, the Four Crowned Heads, who were four people from ancient history, and this was headed up or dominated by King Edward VII. So the leader of this Freemasonic coalition, which gripped the world for decades in the latter part of the 19th century, was King Edward VII of Britain, and it was, of course, the British policy to deal with the German challenge by resorting to war. That they felt that they couldn't match Germany in terms of industry and progress and production, so therefore
the Germans were leaving him in the dust. You're right. Agreed. Yeah.
And the U.S. leaving all of Europe in the dust, really. But in the case of Germany, they felt this was a military threat. So the answer to this was a policy of encirclement, and this was pioneered by King Edward VII, who actually conducted a personal diplomacy. The mechanism that went into motion in late July of 1914 was this Entente, the Triple Entente of England, France, and Russia, that had been personally assembled by King Edward VII, who had died a couple of years before, but his protégés, like Sir Edward Grey, the foreign minister, or Sir Jackie Fisher, the head of the Royal Navy, and many, many others. Sir Winston Churchill's first job in government was to write a daily summary of what was going on in Parliament and send that to King Edward VII. So
and report back to Bernard.
This is a shadow of evil.
And report back to Bernard Baruch as well, who bought him at least twice.
Look, we're talking apples and oranges. You need a microscope to see Bernard Baruch compared to the Emperor of the world, King Edward VII, right? Emperor of India.
I have not heard, Webster, anyone even utter the term Triple Entente in 30 years.
Well, this is what made World War I possible, because without it you couldn't get the war.
It's fascinating.
In particular, the insight was that without Russia you couldn't have a European war, and the great wisdom of Bismarck was to say we're going to have this so-called reinsurance treaty between Germany and Russia, which essentially said that there would be no war between Germany and Russia, no matter what either country might do, whatever wars Russia might be in, whatever wars Germany might be, and they would never line up one against the other. And that, of course, was thrown overboard by the unstable, erratic, neurotic to psychotic Emperor William II. But here, the thing that I wanted to just throw out here, we talk about this as these anniversaries go forward now, because we'll be living through World War I anniversaries for the next 5 years, right? Yeah. And Versailles anniversaries and all sorts of anniversaries. People. Yes, well, a lot of history, the weight of the past generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. But here we go. This is a little story about a guy called Clarence Henry Norman. Now, this is not Sir Montague Norman of the Bank of England. This is Clarence Henry Norman of the Independent Labour Party, which was a sort of a maverick political formation. They were against the war in World War I, and they asserted their independence from the Labour Party in a number of ways, hence the name. So these were, unpredictable people, but they wanted to be guided by principle. So here we have this guy, Clarence Henry Norman, and we have to remember that the time frame we're talking about goes from June 28th, 1914, that's the assassination in Sarajevo, to July 28th, 1914. That's where we get the first declarations of war between Austria and Serbia. Although the British also mobilized their fleet. The British are the first to mobilize before anybody, if you count mobilizing the fleet, which in their case is what counts most. So here's Clarence Henry Norman says he walks. It's a Sunday in England, I think, and he says he's walking down the Strand in central London, and he meets some influential people. He meets a guy who is a top liberal activist of the Liberal Party, and the guy asks him, "Have you heard any news from Sarajevo? Have you heard any news from Sarajevo?" And he's surprised, and he says, "What's Sarajevo? I've never heard of Sarajevo. Where is it? What is it?" And it turns out this, of course, is this town in Bosnia. And then this liberal guy that he's talking to, very distraught, goes off saying, "Is it possible that they screwed up? Is it possible that they blew it?" So he rushes off in complete disarray. And, of course, the news doesn't come until later. Right? It comes in the afternoon that the two successors to the throne of Vienna and of Budapest have been killed by this guy Princip. And then later in the afternoon, the same guy, Norman, goes to a salon, a rich person's home where they're going to have tea. And this is somebody connected to the Northcliffe newspapers and other important British newspapers. And the hostess, who's serving the tea, and there are some top-level British newspaper people and other influentials there. And the hostess says, by the way, this, of course, is the signal for the great European war that we've been talking about for so long, right? This is it. This is at 4:00 in the afternoon. Now, that's a very remarkable statement, because the quality of July 1914, and we're now in July 2014, the agreement of most contemporary observers is that there's a dreamlike quality of unreality and the inability to grasp that something horrendous is about to occur. There is a new book about this called The Sleepwalkers, and I don't agree with much in this book, but the idea of calling it The Sleepwalkers, I think at least captures this as far as the average person is concerned. Most of Europe were indeed people sleepwalking into a world catastrophe. Now, at the higher level, of course, when we get to Sir Edward Grey and Sir Jackie Fisher and some others, you'll see that this is not the case. They want war, and they're going to get war.
Yeah. This is not, you're not saying denial, you're saying people who are sleepwalking or oblivious.
That the average schmo doesn't know what's happening and often lapses into a mood of Pollyanna-ish illusion.
Hey, weird. Keep going. We're going to keep going. Go ahead.
So that may be my question at some of these strategic forums, right? At the U.S.-Russia forum in the Hart Senate building, I asked Ambassador Jack Matlock, who had been the U.S. ambassador to Moscow under Reagan,
Mm-hmm.
and on the whole, not the worst guy among the State Department veterans. Are we in July 1914? He said he didn't think we were, but we may well be. That is, when you look at this stuff in Ukraine. Let me just point out about that. One of the speakers was Stephen Cohen, the professor of Soviet Studies, married to Katrina vanden Heuvel of The Nation. The Nation has actually tried to do some kind of constructive work in calling attention to this danger. Right? But Cohen's opinion is that, you can also verify it, that there's tremendous pressure on Putin to declare a no-fly zone in Ukraine and suppress the bombing of civilians by the Ukrainian Air Force and especially by the right sector.
Right.
So they do that on the ground, right?
Well, they supposedly only have one small battalion of official right sector people. There's a lot of mercenaries involved. Hundreds allegedly killed today, as opposed to only 5 Ukrainian dead. But you can't believe those statistics, as we know the game. We know the game.
The Ukrainian forces were characterized by refusal to engage and then ineptitude. So I can't get into it at that detail, right? But I would just point to the fact that this is extremely dangerous. The other point that Cohen wanted to go into was the danger of tactical nuclear warfare in the Ukrainian situation. Now, this is essentially what I've been saying for 10 years. Since the color revolution, the orange revolution of November 2004, I've tried to point out that this is the most dangerous place in the world because it's really the only place where 2 nuclear-armed forces could collide. That is, the Russian forces who have lots of nuclear weapons and NATO forces, typically Polish NATO troops coming in that would expect to be given the U.S. Nuclear umbrella. So that's what you have going on. So anyway, these books, let me just remind you now, the guy's name is Clarence Henry Norman, and one of his books is called A Searchlight on the European War, and these books were suppressed by the British during World War I. Anything he wrote was suppressed. He was harassed. He was put away for a while by Lord Cave. How about Lord Cave was the Home Secretary? So
they actually
Lord
put
Cave
him away.
Would send you, huh?
They actually put him away.
They put him away for a while. Sure, they have these, what are they called? The Q notices or whatever they are.
D.
They simply say this article cannot appear.
It's
He's
a
got
D
another
notice.
book called D notice. There we go. Some secret influences behind the European war. So, the point about all this is, as we go now through the coming months, there's going to be a lot of blathering by pseudo-historians who are going to try to tell you, and indeed this has already started, right, that of course, Germany is responsible, and the war guilt clause of Versailles, whatever else we want to say about it, it does not hold up. It is not tenable concerning Germany having the sole guilt for World War I. I would say much more accurate would be to say the Freemasonic networks of King Edward VII of Great Britain, and this includes the British government of that point. It includes people like Poincaré in France, Clemenceau in France. It includes Théophile Delcassé, another top French diplomat, the Cambon brothers, Cambon, but it also includes Izvolsky and Sazonov on the Russian side, and it includes any number of other people, right? And I would also point to another guilty party is Count Berchtold of the Austrian government, who seems to. The difference is that Berchtold wanted a regional war. He wanted Austria to crush Serbia, but the people in Britain and France and the same people in Russia, in other words, this British-centered Freemasonic network that reached across the world, they wanted an all-out continental and world war, not just a regional war. And in the middle of all this, you have the pathetic Kaiser, right, the pathetic Emperor of Germany, who is simply, he's incapable of comprehending. He's simply too weak mentally.
Right. Do we see international banking involved in this, and if so, how?
Yeah, of course. I mean, what have I just said, right? International British-centered Freemasonic networks with King Edward VII, and the banks are simply, they're the assets of this network.
I wonder who's an asset of whom, but point well taken.
Well, for King Edward VII, it was very clear. When he would give his, he had a certain amount of assets, right? He would give this to bankers, and he'd say, all right, fine, if you manage my assets, you'll be admitted at the court, and they all wanted to be at the court. But then he said, by the way, if there are losses, you will eat the losses. If there are profits, I will collect the profits. That was the deal. Yeah. And that's Rothschild, Castle, all of them. Every one of them had to accept that deal.
Heads I win, tails you lose.
That's right.
That's where it came from. Clemenceau, I haven't heard about for years. The Tiger, he another character.
There
were a whole bunch of them.
These were British assets. These were people who were, variously obsessed with Germany or Alsace-Lorraine or whatever. Mm-hmm. Naturally, nobody with any brains ever considered war over the actual issue of Alsace-Lorraine. Mm-hmm. But for the British, the British line concerning Germany was, there are no conflicts of interest. There's only a general rivalry for world domination. So that was what it was. And you can find all kinds of literature about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and that is to say, his idea was Franz Ferdinand wanted to take the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, and he wanted to make it into a triple monarchy by allowing the creation of a South Slav kingdom. In other words, what would have been Yugoslavia, with equal rights with the others.
Sure.
And this, of course, was blocked by the Hungarians, by the Magyars, because they would have been the ones out of whose territory that would have been carved. Mm-hmm. But Franz Ferdinand had married a Czech countess, a Czech woman, so he was taking position for the South Slavs, and he wanted to reduce the power of the Magyars, who were very oppressive, very backward landowners over huge areas that were inhabited by Slovenes and Romanians and all sorts of others. And the Magyars, of course, were a minority in their own country, so they had to be very, very oppressive. So he wanted to have, instead of dualism, he wanted to have what's known as trialism. Now, whether that would have ever amounted to anything is anybody's guess, but the idea was that he was some kind of a reformer. And you have to also remember that the assassinations, it's not just one assassination, it's quite a few. And of these others, there's an attempt to kill Rasputin already in the summer of 1914. The actual assassination of Rasputin is in December of 1916 by Prince Yusupov, right?
He was tough as nails, Rasputin.
Prince Yusupov is a homosexual lover of King Edward VII personally. Okay?
Wonderful.
And this Yusupov was one of the richest people in Russia and leads us in all sorts of interesting directions. But the idea was the British were convinced that Rasputin was an agent of the Central Powers and he was pro-German, and there was something to this, although, of course, he was also a monster. So there was an attempt to kill him. And the other assassination, which I would point to, is the assassination of Jean Jaurès, Jaures, with a little accent on the letter E. Mm-hmm. And this was a French socialist. You remember the Socialist International had pledged that if a war broke out, the socialist parties would all vote no money for the war. And Jaurès was somebody who said, that's what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. We're going to say, down with the war, down with the ruling class, not one penny, not one man for this bloodbath. And he was assassinated in the street. So this was the power of this Freemasonic combination.
How things have changed. But you said something really early on. It was a little kind of a quotation about how history lands on our heads. What was that you said? Do you remember that?
What, a long time ago?
Tonight. The pain, the pain of history or something lands on our heads.
Well, we can go back and listen to the recording, I'm sure.
I guess we can. It was a very, very slick little statement.
But now we have to deal with this as it goes along, right? And there's a lot to be said about it, right?
And this is going to lead us somehow to Mr. Sass, I guess, later on.
Yeah, I hope so, because what I would like to really talk about tonight, now that we spent half the program on this other stuff, I wanted to talk about domestic and about a couple of things, right? The first thing is about this Nebraska Senate race, and I want to make an appeal to everybody to do whatever you can to help my friend Dan Buhrdorf, Buhrdorf, and this is danfornebraska.com. Running for United States Senate in Nebraska as the Tax Wall Street Party. Just the idea of having the Tax Wall Street Party on the ballot should excite everybody.
But
we also have a fine candidate, an excellent candidate, very, very competent, mature, tremendous political instincts, and I think it would be a real plus. And he is taking on the establishment of Nebraska. Now, of course, this is a very unsavory matter, right? So I would just sort of allude to it, because most of the stuff you've been kind enough to put on your fine website, right? Wayne Madsen has now spent some time out in Nebraska.
Yeah.
And as a result of Wayne's travels and interviews out there, there's going to be more coming. But in particular, he's got, he's revisiting the scandal of about 1990, 1989-90, and also then how this scandal lives on in the form of this guy Ben Sasse.
Well, Wayne is always welcome here, and I appreciate you. In fact, tell him thank you for me, because I really like to post his material. He's quite an extraordinary reporter and researcher. So
you should invite him directly.
Oh, he's very busy. He's been on before, but yeah, I should. Okay, hold on, Webster. We'll be right back and take a little closer look at Benjamin Sasse in a minute. Okay, and we're back with Webster. Here he is on election night, May 13th, 2014. Let's see if we can get some audio here. I'm not sure if I'll be able to. It's acting a little
odd. Is this Sasse?
Yeah, we should hear the target here. I'm not getting anything. Go ahead. Tell us more about Dan.
I think that the importance is, I'd like to talk about some issues in just a minute, right? But the question now about Sasse is that this gets very ugly, and this really, it in some ways it goes beyond issues. It's an issue of character. There's this very ugly establishment out there, right? And there was this story with the Franklin Savings and Loan and Lawrence King, and the question of child molestation, pedophilia, and important personalities in the state being involved in that scandal.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest covered up stories of our times, frankly.
Wayne Madsen went out there and sort of looked at the cold case files and found that a lot of the people were still around and a lot of the issues were still around. And in particular, his finding was that at a certain point in that scandal, the state of Nebraska had hired an investigator by the name of Gary Caradori. Mm-hmm. And Gary Caradori had flown in a private plane from Nebraska to Chicago to go to a baseball game.
With his kid.
And with his child, and had come back with a briefcase filled with very important documents that bore on this pedophile child molestation.
He had photos,
ring.
He had everything, according to what he said. And they actually found photos.
Crashed.
They found photos in the wreckage. The FBI went over it with a vacuum cleaner, and it all disappeared.
Right, exactly. And now what Wayne Madsen has added to that charge is that he now accuses the FBI of having bombed the plane. That is, the FBI murdered, liquidated Gary Caradori, his son.
Wouldn't surprise me in the least, Webster.
This evidence.
Here's a little quickie with Sasse. Go ahead, finish up, and I'll play a little bit.
Well, the question with Sasse, let's talk about Sasse. We now have a pattern of 3 separate instances in which Sasse has, in effect, covered for pedophiles, right? We don't know what he does himself at this point, but we certainly can say that he acts as a front man or an enabler or facilitator for this. One is when he was the page and proctor, one of 4, of the House Republican pages, 1995, 1996, I believe. And that meant that during the time that the infamous Mark Foley and also this other character, Jim Colby, were actively molesting these children, Sass was the person who should have stopped it. The proctor means the person who watches over the students, right? He's supposed to be the
guardian,
the chaperone.
That's right.
Effect, right?
Yeah.
So he failed big time, but somehow was never touched. Now we find there was in the state of Nebraska, in the board that handled the assignment of foster children to foster homes, there was a woman called Stitt, S-T-I-T-T. And Mrs. Stitt was apparently some kind of a traditionalist and was very careful, tried to be careful, in keeping foster children out of homes where they might be threatened with sexual abuse. So she became a target for some kind of pedophile network. And the way that this worked was, it was found that Mrs. Stitt had attended some kind of a campaign meeting. Now, she was then thrown out of her job on charges connected to the Hatch Act. Now, the Hatch Act applies to federal employees, not state. But the argument came down that the Nebraska Foster Children's Board, with Mrs. Stitt on it, had received federal money, and therefore, even though she really worked for the state, she had to conform to the Hatch Act, and she hadn't done so. The complaint for this came from Health and Human Services in Washington under Bush, at the same time that Ben Sass was the assistant secretary, I guess it was, of HHS, of the part of the bureaucracy there that issued this complaint to Nebraska that cost Mrs. Stitt her job and apparently made it easier to get children into these terrible situations. So that's number two. And then number three, during the time of Sass at Midland University, one of the coaches was arrested by the police for sexually abusing students, children, and then also sort of farming them out, right, prostituting them, pimping them.
Sounds Penn State-ish, yeah.
Yeah, a kind of a Sandusky.
I think a lot more of that goes on than we would ever understand.
Of Nebraska, right? So the mini Sandusky of Nebraska. But again, go back to Penn State. The president of Penn State lost his job, but not Sass. You see? The handling of Sass is very different. Midland University coach arrested, in jail. Ben Sass gets no penalty.
He was being groomed. Sounds
being
like
groomed.
me.
So you got to do something about this. Now, so this is one. DanForNebraska.com. The other one that I'd urge people to look at is New York State, because this is always very important, needless to say, because this is where Wall Street is, and therefore it's always something that we want to pay special attention to. The villainy of Andrew Cuomo is not sufficiently understood, right, because it has not been reported, right? Nobody seems to want to report it, because the only way to approach him is that he's a Wall Street puppet who's been completely attacking the Democratic base, attacking unions, attacking all the interest groups of the Democratic Party, and still thinking that he's going to run for president with all that Wall Street money. So now we have the process for the Democratic primary is now in motion. And here I want to call people's attention to Randy Credico. Randy Credico ran for mayor of New York last autumn. He ran as a Democrat until the Democratic primary in September, and then he became the tax Wall Street Party candidate for mayor and ran all the way to November on that. So he got out the word about the need to tax Wall Street, right? The Wall Street sales tax, which is coming to be the litmus test for anybody who wants to be considered a popular radical candidate.
Is it still hanging around the 1% mark?
1%, sure.
Okay. Well, that's the Tarpley tax.
Certainly not going down. Now, people come forward and say they should pay the normal sales tax. I'm perfectly open to that.
All right. Very good. Stand by. We'll come back in just a couple of minutes with Webster as we continue. Okay, let's get right back to it. A couple of quick words from Ben Sass on primary election night, May the 13th.
The political class past told us there was no way you could run a campaign based on the Constitution and proposing big, bold, conservative solutions at our town halls. And they didn't bet on us because they didn't know you. You're really interested in passing on the meaning of America to the next generation.
Jeff,
you told us that you want a united...
Are you had enough there?
Where he got his money. His biggest contributors are New York banks. Out-of-state banks of any kind, but principally out-of-state. Most of the money from out-of-state, and most of the money in large contributions. Mm-hmm. Not much in the way of the small stuff, right? Not
you know what's interesting? This is kind of deja vu for us. This is rather like you and I going after Obama 9 and almost 10 years ago. Well, 8 or 9 years ago.
Right, exactly. The difference is now I think there's probably more than one Manchurian candidate, but I think this guy Sass is certainly one of them. So in other words, instead of having one principal deployment like Jimmy Carter,
he's been absolutely groomed and
like Askew.
Yeah.
Instead of having Carter, Askew, and as a fallback, or Obama and then Deval Patrick as a possible fallback, I think there are now several of these Manchurian candidates, and they may even be competing. They may be working in synergy, or maybe not. But that would be Sass. But I wanted to just say a couple of words about Cuomo, right? There was something in New York called the bank tax, which was tax specifically on banks, which Cuomo lifted. So he's demanding killer cuts, genocidal austerity for the people of New York State, and at the same time, he's specifically lightening the burden on these financier oligarchs who brought down
another great
the
American. Jeez.
The other thing is that New York State has what I call a Wall Street sales tax. It's very small, but they refund it. It is remitted to the banks as a result of blackmail. Yes, and that's been the case since the late 1970s, since the time of Governor Hugh Carey. I think it has to do with Wall Street saying, we'll go to New Jersey if you don't give us our tax money back, but you get the idea. This is an outrageous situation. So here, the candidate is this Randy Credico, colorful, unpredictable, but he's been fighting these interests for a long time, and particularly last year as the candidate of the Wall Street sales tax. So this is the Wall Street sales tax now personified. And his website is Credico 2014. Now, this is an interesting field because challenging Cuomo are primarily radical candidates from the left wing of the Democratic Party. And here there's this person, Zephyr Teachout, that you may have heard of, right? She's a law professor.
Classic name.
Zephyr Teachout, yes. There is this guy, Terry Teachout, who's a reactionary, right? He writes for reactionary magazines.
They couldn't possibly be related, could they?
He claims no. He claims that they're not related. I don't know, but I would say this Zephyr Teachout is a very weak, very diluted, very timid approach to this entire problem. Essentially, it's a petty bourgeois, left liberal.
Well, they're up against a machine here, Cuomo. Come on.
Yeah, but what? I'm telling you, vote for Credico, somebody with guts, a fighter. He's up against the same machine, right? And he's not getting the publicity. The controlled media have agreed that Zephyr Teachout is the acceptable, respectable alternative to Teachout.
I see.
And I'm saying, screw that. Credico is your man. Again, he's colorful and unpredictable, but he's undoubtedly a fighter. And he has done a lot for this.
Well, let's invite him on the program. Bring him
good.
Bring him on.
Let's get him. Here, we'll get him on. We'll get him on. And the other, I would just mention, though, there's another guy, Howie Hawkins of the Green Party, who has in the past called for New York State to stop refunding the Wall Street sales tax, such as they have it, to these zombie banks. And Howie Hawkins, to his credit, says there should be open debates with Cuomo, with Hawkins, with Credico, and with Teachout. I think that would be worth looking at. And I wonder what Teachout says about having open debate. She apparently hasn't answered on that. So we don't
if you
need
can
to
get
say
this
much
guy
more.
on, bring him on with you, because that would be really good to hear you interact with him, I think. Very good.
All right, fine. Any way you want it, but I'm sure that he'll accept. Now, look, concerning the general proposition, right? The strategy is destroy the Republican Party in place, split the Democrats into two, a Wall Street party and a populist or pro-labor party. Now, what we've had so far is a series of rolling epiphanies from the Republicans. Now, bear with me, I got to move fast. In the Brat Cantor affair, you saw that the Republicans hate Hispanics, all right? They're xenophobic. They don't like immigrants of any kind. In the Thad Cochran affair in Mississippi, it was revealed that the Tea Party candidate, McDaniel, is indeed a racist who wants to cut food stamps and cut federal aid to education, which in Mississippi is the only way you have any special education in that poverty-stricken state, is because of federal payments, and Cochran had the sense to say that. But this taught everybody, once again, the Republican Party is profoundly racist. We've just had the Hobby Lobby decision. The Hobby Lobby decision takes us back to the days when the lord of the Duke or the Count could tell his subjects, the peasants, what religion they would have, right?
Yep.
And that, of course, that's a neo-feudal decision. That's completely unconstitutional. But that also shows the hatred of women by the Republicans, right? The way in which the Republicans responded to Hobby Lobby showed their profound misogyny. There is a war on women. This is it. Then we have the Export-Import Bank. This is extremely interesting. The byproduct of Cantor losing his seat is that there's now a grave danger that the Export-Import Bank will be wiped out at the end of September. This would mean the immediate loss of approximately 250,000 U.S. jobs, and these are some of the most highly qualified jobs in technology. It's got to do with the export of aircraft, the export of generators.
Well, these are upper-level jobs, which we desperately need and can't afford.
We desperately need them. Everybody else has this. China, France, Germany, they all have export-import banks. They're all 3, 4, 5 times bigger than the one we have. The secret here is that the predator, Jeb Hensarling wants to become the Speaker of the House at the end of this year, depending on events. And Hensarling thinks that he can ride in on a wave of money from the Koch brothers and others. But in particular, this question, Hensarling, who's the head of the House Financial Services Committee, Hensarling declaring war on the Export-Import Bank raises the question of Chinese money. Is he getting Chinese money? Is he the Maoist faction, the Chi-Com faction of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill? This is the problem with the Citizens United, is that you don't know whether the money is foreign, right? You can't tell. Dark pools come in, dark funds. My contention is that Jeb Hensarling may be a Maoist agent, and I'm not kidding. That's literally the case. So you destroy the Export-Import Bank, the Chinese will be laughing, and producers in this country will be despairing. And then we have this riot today, right? I would call this an anti-refugee riot. This was the full pathos of refugees, women and children in particular, and a crowd of I don't know, Minutemen. Perhaps we can say white trash.
Is this where they turn the bus around?
Yeah, the bus. This is an obscene spectacle. But again, that just shows the Republican Party hates everybody
California.
who's not from their demographic group. So you go through it: Brat, Cochran, Hobby Lobby, Exim Bank, and this thing. Now we've got a series of bills, right? We need them passed. The highway bill, otherwise there's no highway construction in the summer, right? Hundreds of thousands of unemployed.
We need this so badly.
The farm bill. The farm bill means food stamps, otherwise people starve. Exim, as we've just gone through, 250,000 jobs on the line. There is now an attempt to revive the extended unemployment benefits. This is called the Reed, and this is Reed of Rhode Island, R-E-E-D. Reed Heller of Nevada. These are the two states with the highest unemployment. So to get something beyond 26 weeks, there's an attempt to do that. There's the need, obviously, for immigration, some kind of immigration legislation. We can go through that in some detail. But also student loans, right? People are continuing to be crushed by student loans. And the Republican Party is essentially blocking anything on any of this, right? Even before we get into the details of what should be done. Nothing will be done on any of that if you have these lunatic Republicans. So my essential outlook is there must never be another Republican president, because if there is, they will pack the Supreme Court, and you will have the permanent austerity dictatorship. And by that I mean some of these decisions, not just the Hobby Lobby, but I think also the decision on the recess appointments. You know, Scalia claims to represent the Constitution. Scalia's opinion on the recess appointments is that the need for these recess appointments, and I'm quoting, the need it was designed to fill no longer exists. And its only remaining use is the ignoble one of enabling the president to circumvent the Senate's role in the appointment process. What he's saying there is that in the olden days, it took a long time to get to Washington, so a recess appointment was okay. But now he's saying it's quaint. This is what these same people said about things like the Geneva Convention, remember? Quaint?
Sure.
The Geneva Convention was quaint. Obviously, Scalia thinks that the recess appointments are quaint. Look, if that's in the Constitution, there's got to be a reason for it. And what they're arguing now is the Senate can simply eternally keep up the pretense that it's never in recess, right? You can always have these phony sessions and prevent anything from being done. So who is the enemy of the Constitution here? I say it's Scalia. And I'm amazed that we haven't heard more about impeaching fascist judges. You know, people can
Not
remember the Impeach Earl Warren bumper stickers.
Nothing.
Impeach Earl Warren, remember?
Yeah, I do.
Well, I'd like, maybe we'll start seeing impeach Scalia or impeach the Rats cabal or just impeach fascist judges.
Well, there's a lot of them to go after, that's for damn sure. Lots of them. Thank you, Webster, as always. We'll
okay, are we out of time?
Yeah, that's it, unfortunately.
I guess we are.
You want to pop on later in the month, just let me know. We'll got lots to cover.
I'd like to promote some of these meritorious candidates. And again, that's danfornebraska.com and Credico 2014.
If you can get word to those people, get your staff or someone, invite them, let me know,
sure.
And I'll put them on.
in touch with you.
Oh, very good.
I'll put them in touch with you.
Okay, we'll do it.
Okay?
All right. Thanks. You take care.
See you soon. Bye-bye. Although the British also mobilized their fleet. The British are the first to mobilize before anybody, if you count mobilizing the fleet, which in their case is what counts most. So here's Clarence Henry Norman says he walks. It's a Sunday in England, I think, and he says he's walking down the Strand in central London, and he meets some influential people. He meets a guy who is a top liberal activist of the Liberal Party, and the guy asks him, "Have you heard any news from Sarajevo? Have you heard any news from Sarajevo?" And he's surprised, and he says, "I don't. What's Sarajevo? I've never heard of Sarajevo. Where is it? What is it?" And it turns out this, of course, is this town in Bosnia. And then this liberal guy that he's talking to, very distraught, goes off saying, "Is it possible that they screwed up? Is it possible that they blew it?" So he rushes off in complete disarray. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the news doesn't come until later. Right? It comes in the afternoon that the two successors to the throne of Vienna and of Budapest have been killed by this guy Princip. And then later in the afternoon, the same guy, Norman, goes to a salon, a rich person's home where they're going to have tea. Mm-hmm. And this is somebody to make of that, except the one thing you can make of it is that the events leading up to World War II bear the imprint of Freemasonic lodges, a tremendous campaign by British-centered Freemasonic lodges, and some French ones, but it's the so-called Grand Orient, or Grand Orient, which was the center of French, the sort of Anglophile French Freemasons, and then on the British side we had naturally the York Rite and the Scottish Rite, but we also had these special ones like the Quatuor Coronati Lodge, the Four Crowned Heads, who were two people from ancient four people from ancient history, and this was headed up or dominated by King Edward VII. So the leader of this Freemasonic coalition, which gripped the world for decades in the latter part of the 19th century, was King Edward VII of Britain. And it was, of course, the British policy to deal with the German challenge by resorting to war, that they felt that they couldn't match Germany in terms of industry and progress and production. So therefore,
the Germans were leaving him in the dust. You're right. Agreed. Yeah.
And the U.S. leaving all of Europe in the dust, really. But in the case of Germany, they felt this was a military threat. So the answer to this was a policy Russia might be in, whatever wars Germany might be in. They would never line up one against the other. And that, of course, was thrown overboard by the unstable, erratic, neurotic to psychotic Emperor William II. But here, the thing that I wanted to just throw out here, maybe we talk about this as these anniversaries go forward now, because we'll be living through World War I anniversaries for the next 5 years, right? Yeah. And Versailles anniversaries and all sorts of anniversaries. Yes, well, a lot of history, the weight of the past generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. But here we go. This is a little story about a guy called Clarence Henry Norman. Now, this is not Sir Montague Norman of the Bank of England. This is Clarence Henry Norman of the Independent Labour Party, which was a sort of a maverick political formation. They were against the war in World War I, and they asserted their independence from the Labour Party in a number of ways, hence the name. So these were, unpredictable people, but they wanted to be guided by principle. So here we have this guy, Clarence Henry Norman, and we have to remember that the time frame we're talking about goes from June 28th, 1914, that's the assassination in Sarajevo, to July 28th, 1914. That's where we get the first declarations of war between Austria and Serbia.
Okay, welcome back. 4th of July week. Hope you're making plans for the weekend, and even more than that, I hope they work out for you. You never know. Best laid plans of mice and those others sometimes don't work. Here with us is a man who always has a plan. He is Webster Tarpley, our greatest living historian, and I'm always honored to have Webster on the program as a friend, but more than that, as a great resource for all of you to help understand, even if you don't agree, to get a better slant on things. Remember, the game here is to think. Even if you disagree, the game is to engage in the process. Welcome back, Mr. T.
Thank you very much, Jeff. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. As all things considered can be distilled, I guess that's the best way I can phrase it.
Well, it is now the middle point of the year, and
God, is it ever? Would it last about 3 months, and it's here?
Big events, and maybe we can treat some of them. However, before we continue, I would like to talk mainly about domestic U.S. tonight for a change. But before we do, we have to mark this 100 years since the beginning of World War I, or in particular since the Sarajevo assassinations of the Archduke and his wife,
which happened 1 year after the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. Interestingly enough,
yes, I don't know what in particular of encirclement. And this was pioneered by King Edward VII, who actually conducted a personal diplomacy. The mechanism that went into motion in late July of 1914 was this Entente, the Triple Entente of England, France, and Russia. That had been personally assembled by King Edward VII, who had died a couple of years before, but his protégés, like Sir Edward Grey, the foreign minister, or Sir Jackie Fisher, the head of the Royal Navy, and many, many others. Sir Winston Churchill. Sir Winston Churchill's first job in government was to write a daily summary of what was going on in Parliament and send that to King Edward VII. So
and report back to Bernard.
This is a shadow of evil.
And report back to Bernard Baruch as well, who bought him at least twice.
But look, we're talking apples and oranges. You need a microscope to see Bernard Baruch compared to the Emperor of the world, King Edward VII, right? Emperor of India.
I have not heard, Webster, anyone even utter the term triple entente in 30 years.
Well, this is what made World War I possible, because without it you couldn't get the war.
It's fascinating.
In particular, the insight was that without Russia you couldn't have a European war. And the great wisdom of Bismarck was to say we're going to have this so-called reinsurance treaty between Germany and Russia, which essentially said that there would be no war between Germany and Russia, no matter what either country might do, whatever wars